20 years of research and policy experience in international development. She is currently advising on gender for the SNV Netherlands Development Organisation in the context of investment climate reforms for women in African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. Before this, she was a director and challenge leader for food systems and gender at the Global Challenges Research Fund, a 1.5 billion UK government fund supporting research around the world and delivered by UK Research and Innovation, the UK government's research and innovation funding agency. She has a DPhil in politics from the University of Oxford and a master in public administration and international development from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. I'll hand over to Dr. Tahrat now. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Nazgul. I've already been introduced, so I won't labor too much on who I am. But today I'm going to talk about gender and food systems. And really, I want to take an approach where I want to talk about the kind of things you need think about when you are trying to incorporate gender within projects and programming and studies of food systems and climate change. And the reason I bring up climate change in the context of food system is I really believe that in 2022, it's very difficult to separate food systems and climate change in the work that we do within the food system space, because so much of what we are doing in terms of agriculture, nutrition, food security is so highly impacted by climate change at this point, and vice versa. Agriculture, food security, nutrition, all of these things are having an impact on climate change in turn as well. So hence the relationship that I'd like to talk about between food systems and climate change and how that affects women. But really, this is about how we need to think about genders, and really, I'm going to be focusing on women to a large extent in that context. But if we could go to the next slide, I'm going to assume that not everybody in the audience has worked with gender as extensively as others. So let me just start by speaking about what we mean by gender equality. People of different genders should have equal rights and choices. That is the assumption and that we make when we talk about gender equality being a goal to implement in programming. We can
should really not show my Bambi
make
water
sure
bottle.
to, and we should give careful consideration to the way in which people or groups of people are categorized by gender. We want to consider intersectional characteristics as well in terms of age, marital status, religious group, where it's relevant, ethno-linguistic group, etc. Employment, for example, excuse me. So there's quite a range of characteristics that can have an impact on your experience as a person of a specific gender. A married woman might have a fundamentally different experience of a feature of the economy as versus a woman who is a widow, for example, or an unmarried woman. I mean, just as a general point, a lot of the time, the language that we use to define proposals for research and for programmatic activities and interventions have to be simplified or are by choice simplified into gender categories that are can be quite colonial, Anglophone, Francophone specific. And language does have a huge influence on the way that we talk about gender. I mean, it is quite, it's not going to be a surprise. But the problem with that is that it doesn't always translate accurately at local levels in different countries, because different communities have different experiences of how gender is defined. You have gender categories in different cultures that don't always exist in the United Kingdom or in the United States or in France. But if the people who are funding those programs think of gender in specific ways, we have to respond to that sometimes when we are applying for that funding. We are doing a study that is aimed at a certain audience, for example. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're from a funding organization or you're at the funding recipient end of things, it's really important to think about how much of a range of people exist in the boundaries between, say, rural and urban, formal and informal, male and female, internal or international migrants, abled and disabled, excuse me, and so many other distinctions that can have an impact on experiences of gender and how we talk about it. And it's really important to try to explain where the boundaries become blurred. Today, though, I want to keep it relatively simple, even though I want to make sure that people are aware of these issues, but at the same time, today I'm going to focus to a large extent on equality between men and women in the context of food systems. So fairly straightforward in the sense of the traditional definition. And some of what I will be discussing is really applicable to just about any kind of interventional study made with a gendered lens. So not necessarily specific to food systems or climate change, but generally speaking, these are the things we tend to think about when we're working with gender issues. And I like to use examples from food systems and climate change because those are areas in which I've tended to work most, so I'm most familiar with them. If we could go to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you. So why do we care about gender equality in food systems, or for that matter, in anything else? When it comes to working in program in terms of international development work, it's really not just about, it is, of course, there is a simple moral imperative for gender equality to be a feature and a goal of our programs that we work in. But they turn out to be more effective when we think about gender, when we think about a certain experience of a certain part of the population experiencing those programs differently from another part of the population. It simply makes logical sense to think about how to get women and men equally participating in economic activities, for example, or in social activities where they can have the same level of agency. It's true that the impact of climate change on food systems and vice versa, the impact of food systems on climate change as well has been affecting men and women in different ways, because in most communities, they do have quite different roles and responsibilities with regard to different aspects of food systems. Often women are the primary child care and household caregivers, so they'll be responsible for nutrition on the table. They'll be responsible for bringing food and water to the table, or primarily responsible at least. They will experience things like transport quite differently. For example, they will experience natural disasters in a very different way, where they might often experience these things more severely because they are already more vulnerable in those communities and have lives that are set up in a less resilient way for crises. They respond to different aspects of food systems in different ways due to climate change. Things like soil erosion affect men and women differently if one of them is more responsible for the production of food, for example, and at which part of the food chain are they responsible for the production of food is also quite significant. There are issues with, for example, experiencing biodiversity in food choices, which women may be more concerned with, again, because they are responsible for the nutrition aspect of food. The same goes with waste management, for example. And when I say food waste management, I'm not just talking about waste from the dining table. It's more about waste from the agricultural process where harvests might not be picked in time, or food might be wasted in the process of transporting to the market, for example. And men and women will experience these constraints differently in different communities, potentially. A lot of the time, frankly, what men experience, women experience a worse version of it because they do tend to be more vulnerable in a lot of situations. So that's something to think about, that while they might be facing similar constraints as well as different ones, often women experience them more severely. It's not always the case, but it's often the case, and it's something to really think about and keep in mind. If we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So I want to think about how we need to assess when gendered analysis and programming is necessary. Very often, you may not go into a process of study or programmatic intervention knowing that there's a gender element involved. It may not be that, oh, I really want to do something with gender, so this is what I'm going to do. It could be that, but a general project, I want to make sure I think about gender along the way, because this will make this a more effective program. So it may be unclear at the start of a study whether how to think about gender in this particular context and whether it's actually pertinent. Often it is, sometimes it's not, and that's okay too. But it's important to think about ahead of the program. So you're thinking about setting up a program or a study. You want to think about things like, do I have equal representation on my team between men and women, just off the bat? And that means not just a sort of token number of junior women in your team to make it seem like an equitable team. You want to include them in actual decision-making positions. You want to make sure that presentation and communication materials incorporate women and men on an equal basis, at least from the start. You want to think about how that is going to be relevant to your particular intervention or study. How do men and women participate differently in the context of the program that I am implementing, for example? And do these differences impact the nature of the context within which I'm working? Does it affect opportunities for either gender in a negative or a positive way? Especially a negative way is what you want to think about. And let me try to put that in less abstract terms. For example, women are often involved in aspects of food production in regions like South Asia or in parts of Africa, where they are involved in areas of food production that are considered informal, such as sowing and harvesting crops. They may be restricted from entering later points of the food production chain, such as manufacturing and sale, where the results of that harvest enter the formal agricultural market and are processed into the form that is finally sold in mass, and where you actually make money and profit from that process. That means that women are sort of separated in the food production space into an informal space. And that can be quite problematic because that means that women are not always visible in the formal market side of the agricultural economy. And when you're not identified as a formal participant, it means that you won't necessarily get the same attention in government interventions, such as formal agricultural credit and extension programs, or you're not incorporated in the same way in interventions in general when it comes to thinking about how to improve farming methods and whatnot. You want to think about too, in these contexts where you are actively trying to incorporate women in those programs, where you want to be able to find ways to offer agricultural training programs incorporating women. You want to think not only about how existing programs have successfully promoted men's participation, but how do you change that to encourage women, if at all? Because again, women may have different places within their community. They have other burdens besides what they do on the farm. They are primary caregivers. They are concerned about a whole host of household activities that maybe men aren't responsible for in those communities. And that's a point that I really want to make. You want to think about where women already have the overwhelming responsibility for household tasks and children and elderly care, and are already discouraged from participating in traditionally male aspects of farming in favor of these responsibilities. How do we set up programs so we don't create an additional burden for those women? Often there's a desire to work on empowerment within a community without really paying attention to the context of what that empowerment might mean. You may want for women to have more responsibility in the name of empowerment. What will that mean in terms of their overall burden of responsibility? That's where asking them really matters. It's really important to have a participatory process where right from the get-go, you're thinking about how do we reach women's voices? How do we begin to ask them what it is that they actually want from this program that we want to implement, and how will it help or potentially damage relationships within their communities. I want to talk about some examples of this because I think it's all a bit vague, and unless I talk about actual examples. So if we could go to the next slide, that'd be great. Sorry, could we go to the next slide? Thanks. In terms of examples of what I'm talking about here, there are a few projects that I've been working on recently. One of them is a project on an agricultural cooperative for Senegalese women farmers. Now, the project is already geared as a specific, this is a gender-specific intervention in that its primary goal is to work on gender equality. So there are women-specific questions built into the database of information that is being drawn in order to have an impact on this agricultural cooperative setup. And so I just want to talk about this because there is a difference between gender-specific intervention and gender-sensitive intervention. And because I've been talking about projects in a very sort of rough sense, I just want to talk about where this can come up, this difference. For example, I'm also working on a Côte d'Ivoire project where the project is about facilitating a public-private sector dialogue so that small business owners can have more of a voice in the public-private sector space and think about how these two sectors work together. They do actively want to include women in this intervention. They want to make sure that women business owners are incorporated in this because often women are frequently smaller business owners than men. I would define this as a gender-sensitive intervention because the primary goal is not to do with gender equality. The project is being approached with gender equality in mind, so that one of the goals is to do with gender, and it's trying to think about some of the things that I've brought up just in the last slide about how do you incorporate women in a sensitive way and in a way where they will be able to participate equally. These two next examples, the question of whether gender is relevant, you don't really know right off the bat. These are quite big projects that I've been advising on. One is about enhancing agro-industrial sectors in Togo. Another is about thinking about why the manufacturing sector in Tanzania is not growing more. Quick answer to whether gender question is relevant or not is maybe. You don't really know that right off the bat. It is important to think about whether women's participation in these sectors are having an impact or the lack thereof might be having an impact. You don't really know that right off the bat, Sorry, we seem to be moving backwards. Could we go to the next slide, which is gendered variables to consider? There we go, right there. Thank you. So I just want to move on to the next stage of a project or an intervention or a study. Once you figure out that gender dynamics are relevant to an intervention, which you may not know right off the bat, once you've established that that might be the case, this is when you want to think about things like local context and how gender relations can be affected by local histories, by economic, by environmental needs. You want to be assessing the possibility of doing harm intervening in gender relations. You may actually create lack of a sort of disruption that can be harmful to women and children in that community if you are not aware of the local context and what that might mean. There are examples famously years ago when I was doing work on microcredit and women, there was a real concern that it was causing domestic violence in communities where it wasn't that domestic violence hadn't existed in those communities. It was that it was enhancing the possibility of domestic violence because when men were losing control over the sort of monetary power, it became quite disruptive in those communities. And that's something to think about those dynamics ahead of time. And not just that, but things like ensuring that data is collected in a gender disaggregated in an intersectional way. It's not enough to think about, are men and women experiencing this agricultural extension program differently? You want to think about why they might be experiencing it differently. Does a woman with particular marital status have more prestige? Is she treated better? Is she getting to participate more fully? Versus an unmarried woman who might feel less safe in these spaces where these extension programs are happening, et cetera. You want to think about all of these things and all of these possibilities, because Potential disruptions and changes in responsibility and roles in power structures in households and local economies can cause damage to members of the community. And you really want to, I mean, I keep bringing up the possibility of gender-based violence against women, but it has been an issue in certain interventions in previously. These things haven't been anticipated in advance. And that means, and this, in terms of data collection and the sort of qualitative context that we need to think about, really want to think about things in a very nuanced way if you can. If you have the ability to think about issues such as age, marital status, household head status, ethno-linguistic and religious group where relevant, for example, in communities that have experienced conflict over ethno-linguistic or religious differences, all of these indicators need to be collected if you can in advance. And you can't always do these things in advance, but that would be the ideal setting where you are able to collect this kind of information. Also, it's as you go in to conduct focus group interviews and collect information from men and women in the community, you want to think about discretion, possibly for women to feel comfortable participating in focus groups and other kinds of group meeting. Men and women should be separated where you may need to ensure safe spaces for women to speak up. That may not be necessary. It's just a possibility that in some settings, it might be better for men and women to be separated so that women may feel more comfortable in speaking up, because some cultural contexts require that women's voices may not actually be heard well in male-dominated environments and may even endanger them. In an ideal setting, if you had the resources, it would be great to separate men and women and then see the dynamic that happens together as well when they're being interviewed simultaneously as well. Again, these are all ideal situations because often you don't have time to do all of this intervention. You don't always have the resources and you have to improvise as well. If we could go to the next slide, and talk a little bit about examples of what I'm talking about. Great, thank you. On what I mean when we think about the possibility of harm, for example, I've been working on a project to do with agroforestry in Rwanda. One of the things I did was to look up what region of Rwanda this was happening in, because I wanted to make sure that these were places where maybe, given the context of a post-conflict country, we want to think about issues like that could impact relationships between genders. There are region-specific contexts in countries where, for example, a particular form of conflict may have led to more severe relationships in the community to think about. I think obviously you want to approach this in a very diplomatic way in such sensitive situations. But these are questions you want to ask of, might I be coming across a situation that requires an extra level of sensitivity? And it's an extra level of sensitivity that might actually impact gender relationships as well. It's in less sort of sensitive environments, perhaps, there are still things to think about in this context. Again, with that agricultural cooperative for women in Senegal project that I've been working on, in terms of the questions that are put into the building of the database of information, it's not enough to just ask women what their experience of agricultural credit or agricultural extension programs is and how they're experiencing participating in these programs. You need to ask the men how they're experiencing these things too. Often what I see is that we ask women a lot of questions about their experience, but we're not actually comparing it against anything else. We are just assuming that it's less, they're participating less or they're experiencing things less positively than men without checking on that. And we need to make sure that we check those issues before we just make these assumptions. It seems like a kind of logical point, to an overly logical point, perhaps just basic common sense, but it often can go missing, I think, to think about, we don't just want to assess women's experience, we want to assess it in a comparative context against what men and their male peers are experiencing as well. If we could go to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So let's think about towards the stage where you're actually implementing a program. You're no longer setting this up. You are now at that stage where you are actually making this program or really pursuing this study in real life. Your research project is underway or your intervention is underway. All the previous points that I've mentioned already should probably be built into the implementation where relevant, of course. But also you want to ensure the participation and acknowledgement of both men and women equally in follow-up workshops and publications. What often happens, not often, but it can happen where there's a lot made of women participating equally during the lifetime of the project. In terms of follow-up, not as much. Sort of women who are, excuse me, have participated don't get acknowledged as much in terms of the public face of those projects or what have been learned from those projects in terms of publications and public presentations and whatnot. So that's something to think about as well. The long-term impact of those projects or those studies should incorporate women as well. That means ensuring that men and women are equal recipients and producers of information during and after the intervention. We need to think about the long-term impact of these interventions. It's not enough to just come in, do a study or have an intervention and then walk off without thinking about that long term. And that's where, again, and I keep talking about this because you really want to minimize the possibility of harm. So we want to have a real sensitivity to the local context, because if you don't, it's not just about issues like violence, it's also about sustainability. You want to think about sustainability of these projects beyond the length of the intervention. If you come in and do something exciting on gender equality, you walk away, or you do some great study on gender equality and nothing actually happens in the long term, and those resources that have been put into this program are obviously wasted in terms of a positive long-term impact. So it's really important at this stage too, once the project is underway, to really think about what's really working in terms of ensuring that this positive impact lasts beyond the implementation of this project. And if we could go on to the next slide, I can talk about a couple of programs that I think are somewhat, I've always thought of these projects as kind of superstars in terms of being able to incorporate gender sensitivity into their programming. When I was working in GCRF, one of the projects that they funded, a significant one, was the Tigris program in India. It's a very multifaceted project. It's led by the University of Cambridge, and it's many different aspects to it. But I'm just going to describe it very briefly as sort of work on multiple aspects of resilience of agricultural methods in a part of India that has now, and it started as a sort of relatively, one part of India, but then it's expanding now as well. And it's one aspect of it was cutting down on the use of synthetic fertilizers, because this has been affecting water tables in that part of India. And initially, because most of the farmers participating in that program they were part of the agricultural training program. So you won't get a lot of, would have been quite challenging to get female farmers, people in the farming community who are women, participate in agricultural training. It is important to think about these issues. Am I disrupting this community too much by bringing up, well, let's get women incorporated in this? I mean, you need to think about these issues of being really sensitive while also trying to be as inclusive as possible without being wholly disruptive. What they did in terms of incorporating women was that they incorporated a lot of women researchers who are trained as part of the overall team in terms of serving, in terms of teaching programs, etc. That is, they found a way to have an impact on the gender equality aspect of their work. It's not easy to come in and always want to do the most gender equal thing you can possibly do, but you have to think about the constraints where you are in those interventions as well. So I think these were certain, it's not that the women researchers were trained as part of the team as a compromise per se, but they still found a way to do something gendered in this project without ignoring that aspect, which which is, I think, is great. While there wasn't necessarily a gender equality goal, this overall program, there's a gender sensitive element to this. Also, there was a project, for example, specifically on women moringa farmers in Malawi. And the study in business development program, the study on this project and the business development program followed from that study, really did a great job, I thought, of acknowledging those women farmers are active participants as recipients of the research, the program implementation, follow-up studies. And I think that's, as I said, I think that's really important to make sure that the participants of your research project or your intervention feel acknowledged and that they feel that they have a real voice in what they're doing, because they're not just passive subjects of what you're doing. They have a voice and they have agency, and that needs to be brought out in your interventions as well. If we could go to the summary page next, that would be great. As I sort of begin to wrap up a little bit. I think sort of overall, what I've been trying to talk about and the overall main questions to answer is that you want to have measures to ensure equal opportunities for the involvement, for the acknowledgement of women and men equally throughout the intervention. In some situations, that may mean prioritizing women. That may also, in other situations, you may want to incorporate women and men fully equally throughout the intervention. And you want to do this throughout every stage of the project. And that means developing the project or the study. That means doing the research behind it. And that means also at the implementation stage too, where you want to make sure that women and men are equally participating, that they're ultimate beneficiaries of this research, of the study, in an equal way, where you are trying to create a gender equal project. And you need to really think about the purpose of your project in terms of its specific impacts on women, on the men, on the household and communal relationships with other genders, between women and men, between women and women sometimes as well, between men and men. You really want to think as fully as you can in terms of what could this project lead to, what could the side effects be, am I taking measures to mitigate risk, to safeguard against potentially harmful consequences to the local community? Am I making sure that everybody on my team is safe in these contexts as well? Are they feeling threatened in any way? Is there experience, and I'll just speak specifically about gender in this context. Women may experience this work. Young junior women researchers, for example, may experience this kind of work in a different way. It's really important to think about those issues without disempowering them from participating fully. So in all of this may not seem easy, but it's just very important to remain sensitive and to have these discussions openly so that you understand what can actually be done in terms of solving some of these challenges in individual contexts. Gender-based violence is obviously a specific concern that I would highlight again and again, because that is an issue when you are trying to change gendered relationships, and you really want to make sure that you are not disrupting communal relationships to an extreme level where this can come about. So it's, and also and I'll repeat this again because I really think it's important. When we go into these contexts where we're talking about empowering women, which, you know, is the common programmatic goal, you really need to think about whether you're adding to women's responsibilities, because empowering them may often lead to creating greater burdens. And it's quite important to think about what roles they already have, they feel they have agency over, and not necessarily make a lot of negative assumptions. Again, it's really about listening to the community themselves and trying to get genuine, authentic responses to your questions, and to trying to understand these communities when you may not actually be a member of these communities, you know. I'll move on to final thoughts, and we can start to begin to talk about the questions that might have emerged. So just a few last points that I would bring up. I think one of the things to really think about when you're setting up a team for creating a project or creating, whether it's research or implementation, the need for context specificity. So is really quite important, but you want qualified gender expertise on your team. It's not enough to read a report from FAO or WFP on how women are experiencing food insecurity differently from men. You want somebody who's actually got experience in this area. It really matters. A lot of the time, gender as a field of study is not always taken seriously. It's seen as something a bit light, and do it well, you really need somebody who's trained in this area, because we'll think of issues that you may not have thought of in those local contexts. This happens quite a lot, where I find that coming from a gendered background, I think of issues that a generalist wouldn't otherwise think of, and that's what you want on your team. Also, another point to think about is that working with and surveying women alone in gender interventions may not be as impactful or informative in the long run as working with the community as a whole. And that involves including men and boys. One of the issues I often find in gender equality-driven programs is that men and boys just get left out. And that doesn't really, I believe that creates less sustainable solutions. I think that discovering what the different roles and responses of men and boys are to women and girls is quite powerful in terms of creating really long-term sustainable solutions to challenges that you're seeing on the ground. It's not, I don't believe that there is a really positive long-term impact a lot of the time if you're leaving out half of the community in an attempt to empower another half of the community. It is really important to incorporate both. Excuse me, as I've said before, it's also important to think about the fact that all the data that I've suggested collecting, that would be great to collect, due to lack of access or resources, you may not be able to do that. And that's okay. In situations where you are trying to study a conflict area, perhaps, or a particular area where people are on the move because of some severe climate change trend, and you're facing a lot of sort of migratory communities, it's really important to improvise in these instances in terms of collecting maybe qualitative material or desk research instead. And that's just a point about data in general, where there will be issues with wanting to collect the ideal, most comprehensive set of data you possibly can. It just can't be done sometimes. And that's, it's sometimes important to try to get as close an approximation as you can. And also to be prepared for assumptions to be broken. Sometimes women have more control over certain resources than you might expect in certain contexts. I was speaking to a consultant recently who had worked in Benin on, I believe it was a particular, it might have been sesame, but it was a particular sector of agriculture or production. And I was surprised to hear that, in fact, women had control over the finances in those communities rather than actually providing labor in the fields. It was men who worked in the field, and women had control over the profits and the purse strings, essentially. And that's quite exciting to find out that it's not an issue that we would normally expect to reverse. So this was quite an exciting possibility to consider as well. So prepare for assumptions to be broken and keep an open mind on what you might learn from these projects as well. And that's why it's important to do that kind of advanced context, advanced understanding of context. Also, just as a final thought, I just want to point out that sometimes the constraints that we come across in the food space when it comes to nutrition or transport issues, the way that climate change has been creating more and more constraints in terms of what people are going through to produce food, to consume food. prices going up, agricultural methods having to change dramatically and very quickly in certain places, with varying levels of government support and transparency. It's not always specific. These issues are not specific to one region or even just poor countries, just lower and middle income countries. So I think it's really important to think not just about context specificity, because you cannot create an effective program without thinking about context, but also thinking about shared learning across common contextual places can be quite powerful. There are lessons that the UK can learn from other countries, for example, when it comes to issues like nutrition and behavioral change around nutrition. So it's not a one-way informational learning process between wealthy countries and poor countries. There should be an approach of exchange between regions, between different levels of constraints, etc. But where there's commonality, it's important to understand that commonality and share learning. Think about all the opportunities that has to offer. And that's, again, that's not specific to gender, it's not specific to the food space, but it's useful to think about just as a general approach to research and to programmatic interventions and the learning that we have to draw from them. So I hope that kind of provides it was all very broad overview material that I gave you just now, but hopefully with some of the questions we can drill down with a bit more specificity. So if we could just go to the next slide, that's my final slide. And it's really just to say thank you for listening, and feel free to find me on Twitter or LinkedIn.
Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. There were two things that really stood out to me: was this constant desire to empower women without really thinking about how we may be overburdening them. I think that's often very overlooked, as well as kind of being driven by assumptions. So looking to get information from women and better understanding of how they're experiencing things without actually comparing that with men's experience. So really a lot to think about. Thank you very much.
I have quite a funny example of that, actually. I was translating for a documentary on women's driving schools in Bangladesh. Women don't traditionally drive commonly in Bangladesh. And they interviewed the documentarians. They interviewed a couple of ladies who were watching a driving lesson happen of a young woman, and they asked, "Oh, would you like to learn how to drive too?" And they said, "No, what are our men going to do if we're driving? You know, our men have to do something. I already have a sewing business. I already take care of the kids all day long. I don't need to drive as well." You know, so and that's the kind of thing where it's really important, because we have these ideas of what we think women's empowerment looks like because of our context, you know, and that we walk in with a pre-existing bias. So trying to break that bias is really, really important.
Thank you for sharing that example. I've shared the questions in the chat box. There's a few questions.
Let me see the chat box. Right. So let's see. I'm seeing some introductions. Great. Some of, sorry, the French ones translated?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
Translated.
I can't speak French that fluently, unfortunately. How do we make sure, so Kenny Rizaldo asked, how do we make sure that we remain inclusive and do not overburden women in participating activities? What kind of strategy should we employ? Thank you. So it really depends on what you're doing and what context you're working in. I think some of the basic things to think about is finding out what women are actually responsible for in those communities, in terms, because it will look different depending on what community you're working in, what part of the world you're working in. Are they responsible for going to the market and buying food? Are they responsible for most often, yes, they're going to be the person who is actually cooking the food and putting it on the table. But it's always good to just not make these assumptions ahead of actually working with these communities. So it's good to ask and find out who's responsible for water. It can be very significant as we think about climate change. A lot of communities are running out of water. We want to think about how women might be endangering themselves to access that water, for example. Things to think about also when you are creating an intervention or you want to carry out focus group interviews, etc. Where is sanitation for women in those situations? How are women going to deal with childcare while you're keeping them busy with these interventions? So or elderly care for that matter. I mean, we saw during the COVID crisis, what degree women's time was taken up with household care, how much and how insecure their income producing activities became because they were often the ones on shorter term contracts, etc., rather than men who had longer term contracts and more sort of stable jobs a lot of the time. So it's really important to think about these issues, and they will differ really depending on individual contexts. Issues like sanitation, childcare are things to think about in any intervention, I think, though, when you're thinking about how do I not overburden women? And most importantly, ask those women what their concerns actually are, and create a space where they feel comfortable with being truthful as possible. Let me move on to the next question. Thanks, Tahrat, for refreshing. Emily Monville says, thanks, Tahrat, for refreshing us on important gender terminologies. You've emphasized gender equality, but some people advocate for gender equity. Can you further explain what is the difference between the two? I believe the distinction between equity and equality, and this is quite a semantic distinction. I think fundamentally we want women and men to participate equally in the economy and social activities. We want women and men to have equal access to choices, equal choices, I think. Not necessarily that they should have to do exactly the same things in every context, but just to have the choice of being able to do those things is really what we're aiming for. I believe the distinction between gender equality and equity is the assumption of wanting to, equity, I believe, is about the assumption of wanting to reach exactly the same place, whereas equality recognizes that men and women have different roles and different spaces, and equality may not necessarily mean that women are participating in exactly the same way as men are. But I must say, I might be fudging the response a little bit on this, but it's not a distinction that I think about very much, in all honesty. Sorry, okay. I hope I didn't. Okay, Alexandra Newland said, thank you, Tahrat, for such an insightful and useful presentation. Could you share examples of best practice on changing social norms in communities where women and girls are traditionally seen as inferior to men to improve food and nutrition security? In particular, examples involving men and boys, as well as religious and traditional leaders. Could you also please explain the difference between gender sensitive and gender transformative approaches, ideally with examples in the nutrition sector? Sure, I'll start with the last question. So with gender sensitive approaches in nutrition, you might want to think about, for example, whether a particular community is affected by a certain disease that they're experiencing in their food production. That means that they're not accessing a particular vitamin or mineral as they were before. This is just a completely made up example. In that context, a gender sensitive approach would be to think about women and men experiencing this differently, because the goal is to make sure that the community as a whole is not suffering nutritionally. You want to make sure that the women and girls are not suffering in an undue way. So while the main goal is not to approach it to create some gender equality, the gender sensitivity aspect of it is that you are thinking about women separately and making sure that you're not missing a beat in terms of whether women and girls are experiencing this more severely than men because they have less access to food and might not eat at the table at the same time. You'll see communities where often women and girls there's a big gap in nutrition. That's actually quite common in South Asia, where men and boys are prioritized at the dinner table in terms of sort of access to food, good food in particular, and good nutritional food. So that's something to think about when you're thinking about how a community is experiencing nutrition. As for gender transformative approaches, I mean, one of the gender transformative, it's what I just said in terms of there being a gap in terms of nutrition. A gender transformative approach in nutrition would be to specifically work on closing the gap between men and women at the dinner table. And how would you do that is quite a challenge. For example, you asked about best practice on changing social norms in communities. One of the reasons in South Asian countries that there is this nutrition gap is because of this idea of inferiority, that girls and women are less important. And that is hugely problematic. So how do you approach that where you're trying to not create more trouble for women and girls in this context? You want to be approaching this in a way that is sensitive. One of the things that has been really useful, and you mentioned it yourself, is engaging religious leaders in these communities. It can be hugely useful to train religious leaders to think about what is good for the community as a whole. Having healthy women, healthy girls is good for a community as a whole, especially where you have to think about issues like women in pregnancies being able to access the nutrition that they need. All of those things seem like common sense, but they don't always need to be discussed. They need to be highlighted. And the idea you suggested of engaging religious leaders is hugely useful. It's not always religious leaders, of course. You can have community leaders to engage with as well. But part of that is getting to know these communities, and part of that is also going to these communities with an open mind and trying to figure out who the sort of main points of contact should be in terms of trying to encourage this community to think about nutrition for women and girls differently and why it's important. There are other ways to encourage this, of course. I mean, we've seen in Bangladesh, there's been a huge level of success with getting girls to go to school by making sure that families are given food in return for sending girls to school. So there are other incentives to create as well, where, but that's created a few issues too, because over time we're actually seeing that boys are dropping out of school and working on farms while girls are going to school. And that can, over time, that can be problematic to create sort of ongoing financial incentives. But it is one way to, it's been hugely effective in terms of having girls stay in school and not getting married off at 14 or 12. They finish their schooling. It means that they're going to be more educated. They're going to make better nutritional decisions when they have children for themselves as well, because women just aren't just mothers. They're also individual people. And that's another issue too. I think we often approach these communities thinking of women's roles purely as mothers instead of thinking, and it is important to think about maternal health. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't. It's not the only way in which to think about women and girls' health as well. Just a side note, but let me move on from that question. These are interesting questions, so I keep talking. I kind of get stuck on tangents. Lillian Niamongo offered a link to a gender toolkit from Mercy Corps AgriFin website. It looks really useful. I have not seen it myself, but thank you for sharing. Question from Mashal Arbab. Thanks for the insightful presentation on the need to incorporate gender in key decisions. Sorry. Gender aspects and key decisions. In Pakistan, rural women are mostly responsible for working on farms to meet their family's food needs. Nutrition is a serious issue for these women. How do you think this can be met? It's some of the things I would argue that you have some great examples within South Asia of how we've been dealing with women in nutrition already. I give you the Bangladesh example of the conditional cash transfers, not cash transfers, but food transfers, where families are given food on the condition that girls go to school. That encourages families to share food with girls as well. In terms of sharing food at the table, that is difficult because women are often seen as an economic burden. So around about, I mean, in the long run, changing the perception of women as being women and girls as being a financial burden will change that dynamic of seeing them as less than the dinner table. Seeing them as equal economic participants in a society is a sort of I believe is a long run solution. That means making sure that girls and women have the same level of education, are participating in the labor force equally. But in the short run, I think intervention is necessary. I think it is necessary to communicate through religious leaders, through government leaders as well, that it's important for girls and women to have equal access to food because they're equal individuals in society. I mean, there has to be social messaging around this. Otherwise, there are all these mechanisms that encourage women and girls to be equal participants in society are useful in the long run, but in the short run, there has to be social messaging around this. There has to be willpower within policy circles to make this happen as well, in a way where you can because you want to be able to intervene in these communities without causing too much disruption. So doing that in a sensitive way will be specific to individual communities. What works in Balochistan may not work in Sindh, for example. There are cultural context issues for specific communities that I think are important to consider as well. I don't think every community in rural Pakistan is going to look the same. And the leadership required in those individual communities will also be probably different points of contact, I think, as well. So yeah, I think there's it's not an easy answer. There's a whole range of issues, I think, when it comes to this food gap in South Asia in general. But looking at what Bangladesh has been doing is useful in that context, I think, because the gap has been narrowing over there. And it's useful to use these learning mechanisms because it is a problem that is huge across South Asia, like all South Asian, all these countries, most of the countries in South Asia are experiencing this, with the possible exception, I think, of Sri Lanka. We'll move on to gender equality or equity. Sorry, I'm having difficulty with this chat box.
No, don't worry. That was a compilation of the questions above, but there is one question from our French-speaking colleague, which was gender equality or equity, because men and women do not naturally have the same skills in all areas.
I'm not sure what the question is there, though.
Yeah, I think it's possibly about the
equality versus equity question.
Yeah,
and not starting from the same space. Sure, I guess that is something to consider. I mean, as I said, there are specific. You don't have to walk in and completely disrupt roles that men and women have in a society. That doesn't work. It will not have a sustainable impact. But the issue is not about always giving women and men exactly the same opportunity. It's to make sure that they have equal choices in the long run as well. And that can't happen necessarily overnight, but it is useful to think about what we're aiming for as a matter of choices. That is something to think about, not just in the context of men and women, but in the context of all genders having all identifications or self-identifications of gender, just simply having equal access, equal choices, and dignity, dignity of choice, especially when it comes to food. One of the things I learned working closely with a colleague who works in conflict is that there's a real dignity associated with having choices when it comes to food, especially in a conflict environment where certain people are, are able to be ahead of the line when it comes to food aid in sort of extreme humanitarian crises. it's really important to think about choices in that way, I think. It's a useful way to think about choices, to think about dignity that is associated with having those choices. So I have a tangent, but I don't think it's that important to get hung up on the semantics of equality or equity, because I think it's fairly obvious what we're aiming for with interventions that are about gender, are about transforming gender relations in a way where everybody has the same kind of choices. Let's see, are there any new questions after that? I think so. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it. Maybe we can open the floor up to any
Sure.
additional questions.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So if anyone has any questions they'd like answered by Dr. Tahrat, please just jump in or put your hand up.
Yeah, we've got time. So if you've just got comments as well, that's useful too. Anyone? I mean, admittedly, it's quite a broad overview that I gave, so I didn't really talk about too many specific studies there. I think if
we have a hand.
Oh, we do. Excellent.
Please go ahead.
Bonjour, je parle en français, hein, je suis Jules Libre du Gabon. Hello?
Hello, this is Jules from Gabon. Can I speak in French?
Yes, that's fine.
Sorry, I would need that interpreted, sorry, for me.
Are you in the English channel on the interpretation?
C'est moi qui effectivement a posé la question relative à l'équité ou l'égalité entre les gens. Effectivement, la réponse a été donnée.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Excuse me, please. I think Jules' network is patchy and we can't really listen to him. So I think we should really understand the various contexts that apply to each country. And in many domains, as far as agriculture and education is concerned, they have their own roles to play. The connection was really patchy, so we couldn't really listen to Jules, but this is briefly what he had to say. Thank you.
Dire que nous sommes impliqués, ça dépend du contexte dans le suivi. Allô,
While I'm waiting for that, I can answer the question.
So, excuse me, Jules, can you post your question in the chat? There are so many interferences. Jules is going to post his question in the chat.
I'll answer the question about religious leaders. Shahrzad Amoli asked, I had a question about religious leaders. How slow and patient should the process be, ensuring religious leaders actually become supporters and help influence those they preach? Well, again, it really depends on the context that you're working in. There are, even within a country, there are going to be parts of a country where communities are considerably more conservative, considerably more religious, and other parts of the country. If you're working, I return to the context of Bangladesh because that's the country that most of my own research has been on. Northeastern Bangladesh, for example, is considerably more conservative in certain districts than, say, southwestern Bangladesh. So you're going to be working with a very different sense of dependency, not dependency, but sort of, there are going to be different levels of education in different corners. There are going to be different levels of how powerful women already are in these communities. You'll find communities where women actually have more power than you might expect. There are senior women who are very much community leaders in certain contexts, but it really is very specific. I mean, I keep repeating the same point. Context specificity is everything in these programmatic interventions. The level at which you want to push. If the question is on a national level, how do we ensure that this goes smoothly? A process like trying to train the next generation of religious leaders. Again, it really depends on what is the dynamic that you're working with, what is the political context, and you can't ignore socio-political contexts. I think as a former economist, I was trained in economics, but I switched to politics later in my work. We sometimes miss this as economists, to think about context, political, social context, and that can not just be ineffective, but potentially dangerous as well. So I'm going to make a point about interdisciplinary research here. It's really important to have a team of people or engage groups of people in the kind of work that this involves, to make sure they've got the expertise to understand local context in a socio-political way, even if you're working on, if it's a solution to do with water in a community, for example, even if you're thinking about how water is shared in those communities, there might be a social context to this that you might need to think about in terms of who has access to the water, which communities are sharing that source of water, things like that. Whether women have access to that water to the same degree that men have access to the water. All of these things are things to think about. And I once went to a conference of engineers where they were working on development solutions, and I said, anthropologists should be your best friend in these contexts, because you really need to learn local context to make these solutions work. So no matter how technical solution might be, it's really important to understand that local context in a as deep a way as you possibly can, given resources on time and restrictions. Sorry, restrictions on time and resources. Okay, let's see. Thank you very much for this presentation. We should really understand the various contexts of each country in many domains. As far as agriculture, they have their own roles to play. That's great. Yes, and I guess that's why I keep emphasizing issues of context. Thank you so much for this. Can you please help me clarify the link between climate change, food systems, and nutrition, and how the gender dynamics play out here? I need clarity. Okay, so the links between food systems and climate change and nutrition are and this is just one example. There are many different relationships between the food and climate change space. There are contexts, for example, where because of a drought, people need to move, and they are going to be migrating internally between one region and another. Often, this is a much more challenging process for women to do, because again, they are primary caregivers. They are going to be the ones dealing with food constraints along the way. And that means that they might be experiencing nutrition differently as well, because if you've already got the baseline of gender inequality when it comes to access to nutrition, in times of crisis, it's going to get worse. The issue that climate change is creating is that it's one of the issues, obviously not so many issues to do with climate change and food, but one of the many issues is that it's creating a lot of insecurity and volatility in terms of crisis, food crises, water crises, and the resilience that women have to exhibit in these situations can be more extreme sometimes than what men have to exhibit because they're already in a more vulnerable place to begin with. I mean, again, I'm going to give COVID is a good example because it's a relatable crisis because it just happened. But it's in crisis situations in general, you'll find that women tend to experience these crises more severely because they're already the more vulnerable group in that society. So they're already dealing with more insecure food consumption, more insecure water consumption, less access to certain opportunities and to certain choices, to be able to smooth their consumption of food and such. So when there is a crisis created by climate change, the long-term climate change moment, for example, where you'll have a drought or you'll have a flood, they tend to be in a more insecure position. I mean, it's as simple sometimes as having access to learning how to deal with swimming in water sometimes. You know, girls in certain communities don't even get taught how to swim relative to men. That doesn't have to do with food, but it is an example of dealing how women are often unable to deal with these levels of crises with the same skills that men are allowed to develop as well. And as the primary caregivers, they are on the front lines of, women are on the front lines of the nutrition story. Sorry, can that be translated for me? I hope that helps to, I hope that helps to clarify somewhat. It's just a couple of examples that I gave you, but there are a lot of relationships between climate change and food systems, nutrition. Another issue is the decreasing biodiversity of food options that we have. When certain kind of crop becomes whittled down, say bananas, for example, we largely eat one kind of banana in a good chunk of the world. They're Cavendish bananas. They tend to be produced in countries like Colombia and Bolivia. And because of a fungal disease that has come up because of climate change, and because this fungal disease is actually wiping out those particular bananas, it is going to be difficult to access that. I mean, it sounds like a silly example because I'm talking about bananas. It's not like it's wheat or it's rice or something. It's just a single fruit. It goes to show how the way that we produce food has become increasingly less diverse. And that is problematic because one of the effects of climate change is that certain diseases are flourishing, and if we're dependent on only one breed of a crop globally, it can wipe out that source very easily. So those are things to think about. So another example of climate change, food systems, and nutrition being interlinked in that way. I'm going to move on to the next one. I should not generalize about the non-participation of women in project monitoring because depending on the context and the project, once again, will be involved or not in project monitoring. Yes, it is true. But it really depends on non-participation. It's usually a good idea to have a gender balanced team, though. I can't really think of a context where it would be problematic to have a gender balanced team. Perhaps in very, very deeply conservative contexts where it's an intervention where women are too much of a public face of an intervening team or an intervening research project could be problematic, I suppose. But I mean, in general, we want to take the approach of gender equality being the default in terms of team and project structure. Yeah, diseases are depleting food varieties. Awesome. It is an issue. Biodiversity in food, in the food products that we eat is, food produce that we eat is a real issue. I came across a really interesting project in India where a community was trying to protect a particular breed of rice that they had traditionally eaten